Alright, today we will be looking at Jesus' trial before the high priest and Herod and Pilate, and Peter's denial. Rhyme. And let's start with John 18:1 through 14. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Okay? Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, Jesus, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of these you gave me. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the officials, arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good for one man if one man died for the people. First thing we see here is how powerful Jesus really is. Jesus states in Matthew chapter 26 verse 53 that he could call upon God to send an army of angels to save him. So the fact that Jesus could have stopped this at any time and didn't have to go through this makes his sacrifice even greater. This also shows how close Peter was to Jesus. Peter was willing to kill for Jesus, and probably would have if Jesus hadn't stopped him. Now let's look at verses 15 through 19. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside at the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. Okay, so here we see Peter was not as ready to die as he claimed. Peter was, in fact, quite scared that he denied even knowing Jesus. but we'll come back to Peter momentarily. But first, let's look at Luke 22:63 through 65. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. So here's the beginning of Jesus' suffering. Jesus suffered at the hands of these men for our sake, and this was only the beginning. Now let's move on to Matthew 26:57 through 68. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, two came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, coming on the clouds of heaven." Amen. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Okay, so what we see here is Jesus telling them plainly that he is the Son of God. This made the council so angry that they spit on him and began to beat him. All this was a result of the hatred that they built up toward Jesus throughout his ministry. Now, they tried to bring false accusations against Jesus and couldn't find any, though Jesus did say he was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. However, Jesus was speaking of his body, not the temple in Jerusalem. By saying he would destroy it and rebuild it in 3 days, he was talking about his death and resurrection, as we will cover in our next lesson. Now let's get back to Peter in John 25 through 27. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still standing there, warming himself. So they asked him, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter cut off, challenged him, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Again Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster crowed. So here we see what Jesus predicts come to pass. By denying Jesus, Peter did save his life, but momentarily turned his back on the Son of God. Us denying our relationship with Jesus in fear that we may be persecuted is probably the most hurtful thing that could be done to him. Peter thought he was strong enough to withstand this persecution and to go die with him, and he was wrong. So he died. He momentarily turned his back on Jesus, one of his closest friends and the man he followed as a disciple. However, Peter would come back from this. Peter went on to become one of the most well-known and influential members of the early Christian church. And though he wasn't ready at the time, Peter would eventually die for Jesus. At this point, I would also like to point out that Jesus was completely alone. At this point, all of his disciples had deserted him, including Peter. Because, again, they were scared. They didn't want to die. And that is understandable. But you should never turn your back on the Son of God. Now let's look at Matthew 27, 1 through 10. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans on how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us? They replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priest picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used him to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. So here we see Judas finally paying for his crime, his betrayal against Jesus, of Jesus. Like Jesus said, it would have been better if Judas had never been born, because he wouldn't have suffered such a tragic fate. What stands out here is the chief priest's reaction to Judas' remorse. They were so glad to have finally condemned Jesus, who had been their enemy, as they saw it, for a few years, that they didn't care how Jesus felt. These were truly wicked men. So much so that Jesus says, if we are no better than they are, we cannot enter heaven. Okay, finally, let's look at Jesus before Pilate in Luke 23, 1 through 25. Then the entire council took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. They began to state their case. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is a Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "You have said it." Pilate turned to the leading priest and to the crowd and said, "I find nothing wrong with this man." Then they became insistent, "But he is causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem." "Oh, is he a Galilean?" Pilate asked. When they said that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas, because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction, and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law stood there shouting their accusations. Then Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally, they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. Herod and Pilate, who had been enemies before them, became friends that day. Then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders along with the people, and he announced his verdict. You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence and find him innocent. Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty, so I will have him flogged and then I will release him. Then a mighty roar from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, rose from the crowd and they shouted, Kill him and release Barabbas to us. Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, Crucify him! Crucify him! For the third time he demanded, Why? What crime has he committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death, so I will have him flogged and then I will release him. But the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to death as they had demanded. As they requested, he released Barabbas, the man in prison for insurrection and murder. But he turned Jesus over to them to do as they wished. So here we see the council bring Jesus before Pilate and Herod in hopes that they would put him to death, neither of which found him of wrongdoing of any crime. The sad thing here was that these men wanted Jesus dead so badly that they were willing to take Barabbas, a murderer, and essentially possibly put their own people in danger. They were willing to have an innocent man executed and let a guilty man go free. As we reach the final part of this lesson, keep in mind that Jesus didn't have to do any of this. He could have stopped, didn't have to go through any of this. He could have stopped this at any time, but for our sake and the sake of our sins, to free us from them, he shed his blood on the cross, as we will cover in our next and final lesson. So, tune in next time as we reach the final lesson in this series, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This will probably be longer than these other lessons, and I may take 2 weeks to do this. I may get it done in 1 week, but it may take me 2. So just letting you guys know ahead of time who do tune in to watch this. So yeah, next time will be the final lesson in this series. And then I plan on moving throughout the rest of the New Testament and looking at how Christians should live their lives in various aspects of it. So until then, goodbye and God bless. Stephen out.